Hello, everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. When last we left off with this story, we had discovered that the narwhal predicted by Monsieur Pierre Aronnax, the narrator and primary character of our tale, was not a narwhal. This beast that had been hunted across the world's oceans was in fact a giant submarine, a powerful vessel commanded by a mysterious and enigmatic person known only as Captain Nemo. Captain Nemo has led our narrator on a tour of the vessel, but there is still so much more to see, and that is where we will begin today, with Chapter 12, All by Electricity. Monsieur, said Captain Nemo, pointing to the instruments hanging on the walls of his room, these are the devices needed to navigate the Nautilus. Here, as in the lounge, I have them always in sight, and they tell me my exact position and direction in the middle of the ocean. Some of them you already know, such as the thermometer, which gives the inside temperature of the Nautilus, the barometer, which indicates atmospheric pressure and predicts changes of weather, the hygrometer, which shows the dryness of the air, the storm glass, whose contents decompose and announce the arrival of storms, the compass, which gives me my course, the sextant, which, by determining the height of the sun, gives me my latitude, my chronometers, which permit me to find out my longitude, and lastly, my telescopes, one for the day and the other for nighttime use, with which I examine every corner of the horizon when the Nautilus is on the surface. These are the usual nautical instruments, I answered, and I know how they are used, but I see others, which undoubtedly answer the Nautilus's special needs. Isn't that dial with a moving needle a pressure gauge? Yes, it's a pressure gauge. It's in contact with the water outside, and by giving me its pressure tells me at what depth I'm traveling. And are these some new kind of sounding lines? They're thermometrical sounding lines to give me the temperature of the various layers of water. And what are these other instruments which are completely unfamiliar to me? Before going any further, Professor, I must explain a few things, said Captain Nemo. So please, listen. After a few moments of silence, he said, there is one source of power which is obedient and rapid, easy and pliable, and which reigns supreme on board my ship. It does everything. It gives me light, heat, and is the soul of all my machinery. This source is electricity. Electricity? I cried, somewhat surprised. Yes, monsieur. But, Captain, the great speed with which your ship can move would seem to have little to do with electric power. Until now its dynamic force has remained very limited and able to produce no more than a very small amount of energy. Professor, answered Captain Nemo, my electricity is not the usual kind, but I hope you will permit me not to go into it further. I won't insist on the matter, monsieur, and I will be quite satisfied to be astounded at the results you have obtained with it. There is one question I would like to ask, however, but you need not answer if it is indiscreet. The materials you use to produce this marvelous source of power must get quickly used up. How, for instance, do you replace your zinc without going on shore? I will answer these questions in a moment, Captain Nemo replied. First, however, I would like to mention that in the ocean depths there exist mines of zinc, iron, silver, and gold, which would be quite easy to exploit. But I have used none of these earthly materials. I wanted to take only from the sea itself the means of producing my electricity. The sea? Yes, Professor, and it was not difficult. In fact, by establishing a circuit between two wires at different depths, I could have obtained electricity through the resultant differences in temperature. But I preferred to use more practical systems. What were they? You know the composition of seawater, don't you? Every 1,000 grams contain 96.5% of water and about 2 2/3% of sodium chloride. And then small quantities of magnesium chloride, potassium, magnesium bromide, magnesium sulfate, and carbonate of lime. So you see that it contains a relatively large proportion of sodium chloride, and it is this sodium that I extract from seawater and use as a basic element. Sodium? Yes, monsieur. When mixed with mercury, it forms an amalgam which can replace zinc in batteries. The mercury never gets used up, only the sodium is consumed, and the sea itself furnishes me with a steady supply of it. And besides, let me tell you that sodium batteries are the most powerful of all, their electromotive force being double that of zinc batteries. I can well understand, Captain, the excellence of such sodium. The sea contains it, fine. But you still have to manufacture it, extract it. How do you manage that? Your batteries could obviously be used in this process, but if I'm not mistaken, the amount of sodium used up in this process would be greater than the amount extracted. You would therefore be using it up faster than you could produce it. No, Professor. I don't extract it by means of batteries. I merely heat it by means of coal. Coal? I said. Yes, but gotten from the sea, replied Captain Nemo. Can you dig coal from underwater mines? Later you will see me do it. I only ask you to be a bit patient. You'll have plenty of time for patience. But keep this in mind. I get everything from the ocean. It produces my electricity, and electricity gives the Nautilus its heat, light, and movement. In short, its life. But not the air you breathe. Oh, I could make the air I need, but I could see no use in it since I can surface any time I want. But if electricity doesn't supply me with air, it at least operates the powerful pumps which store it in special tanks, thus allowing me to remain in the ocean depths as long as I want. Captain, I said, I can only admire what you've done. You have obviously discovered something which other men will one day find out. The true dynamic force of electricity. I'm not so sure they will find it, Captain Nemo answered coldly. But in any case, you already know one use I've made of this precious source of energy. It gives us a light that is more uniform and continuous than that of the sun. Now, Look at this clock. It's electric, and works with an accuracy that surpasses the finest chronometers. I've had it divided into 24 hours, like Italian clocks, because for me there exists no day or night, sun or moon, but only this artificial light that I bring with me into the ocean depths. As you can see, it is now 10 o'clock. Precisely. Another use of electricity. This dial in front of us indicates the speed of the Nautilus. It is connected by an electric wire to the patient or patent log, and its needle tells me the ship's actual speed. Right now, in fact, we're cruising at 15 knots. Oh, marvelous, I replied. How right you were, Captain, to use such a source of power. It can replace wind, water, and steam. We're not through, Monsieur Aronnax, said Captain Nemo, getting up. If you will be kind enough to follow me, we'll visit the after part of the Nautilus. I was by now familiar with the entire forward part of the submarine, and here is an exact description of how it was divided up, starting amidships and going forward to the spur of its prow. First there was the dining room, 16.5 feet long and separated from the library by a watertight bulkhead. Then the library, also 16.5 feet long. Afterward came the big lounge, 33 feet long, separated from the captain's room, which was 16.5 feet long. Then my cabin, 8 feet long, and lastly an air reservoir, which was 24.5 feet long, and extended up to the bow. That made a total of 115 feet. The watertight bulkheads held doors that could be hermetically closed by means of a kind of rubber gasket around the edge, and these doors made the Nautilus safe, even if it should spring a leak. I followed Captain Nemo down the gangway to the center of the ship. There I saw a kind of well between two watertight bulkheads. An iron ladder against the wall led to its upper end. I asked the captain where it led. To the dinghy, he replied. What? You have a dinghy on board? I exclaimed in surprise. Certainly, and it's a splendid little boat, light and unsinkable. We use it when we want to go fishing or out for a stroll. But that means you have to surface in order to use it. Not at all. This dinghy is lashed to the upper part of the Nautilus's hull and set in a hollow place especially designed for it. It's completely covered by its own deck and thus absolutely watertight. It's held down with strong bolts. This ladder leads to a hatch in the Nautilus's hull which corresponds to a similar hatch in the side of the dinghy. This allows me to go straight up into the dinghy. The crew closes one hatch, the one on the Nautilus, and I close the other by means of press screws. I then undo the bolts and the boat shoots up to the surface. Once there, I open the hatch cover, which till now has been kept tightly closed, set up the mast and sails, or take out my oars, and I'm off. But then, how do you come back on board? I don't come back, Monsieur Aronnax. The Nautilus comes to me. At a command by you, I suppose. Yes, a command from me. I remain attached to it by an electric wire. I send them a message, and that's that. Right, I said, intoxicated with all these wonders. Nothing could be simpler. After passing the stairs which led to the platform, I saw a cabin about 6.5 feet long in which Conseil and Ned Land were busy devouring their lunch. From there, a door opened onto a 10-foot kitchen situated between the ship's vast storerooms. There, all the cooking was done by electricity, which for this purpose was even more powerful and obedient than gas. Platinum sponges, connected to electric wires and placed beneath the tops of the stoves, gave off an even heat over a large area. Electricity was also used to heat a still, which, by means of evaporation, supplied excellent drinking water. Next to the kitchen there was a well-laid-out bathroom, complete with hot and cold running water. Beyond the kitchen was the crew's quarters, about 16.5 feet long, but the door was closed, and I could not see how it was furnished, and hence, perhaps, get an idea of the number of men needed to operate the Nautilus. Then came a fourth, watertight bulkhead, separating this room from the engine room. A door opened, and I found myself in the compartment where Captain Nemo, undoubtedly a first-class engineer himself, had placed the machinery which drove his vessel. This well-lit room was at least 65 feet long. It was divided into two sections. The first contained the apparatus for producing electricity, and the second, the mechanism for transmitting this power to the propeller. I was, first of all, surprised by a rather peculiar odour which filled the compartment. Captain Nemo guessed my thoughts. "It comes from the gas given off in using sodium," he said, "but it produces nothing more than a slight discomfort. And besides, every morning we purify the ship by ventilating it with fresh air." In the meanwhile, I was examining the Nautilus's machinery with the greatest curiosity. "As you can see," said Captain Nemo, "I use Bunsen cells instead of those developed by Ruhmkorff, which would have been useless. The Bunsen cells are few, but large and powerful, which in my experience is an advantage. The electricity passes back through big electromagnets, actuating a set of rods and gears which in turn transmit the power to the propeller shaft. The propeller is 20 feet in diameter and can do up to 20 revolutions per second." "What speed does that give you?" 50 knots. There was a mystery behind all this, but I did not want to ask too many questions. How could electricity be made to produce such power? Where did this almost limitless force originate? Was it in some high tension developed by a new kind of coil? Was there something about its transmission that an unknown system of levers could increase infinitely? Side note. And so it happens that people are now talking about just such a discovery, in which a new system of levers produces considerable power. Did the inventor meet Captain Nemo? There was no way of knowing. "Captain Nemo," I said, "I'm fully aware of the results, and I don't expect any explanations. I saw the Nautilus maneuver around the Abraham Lincoln, and so I'm well acquainted with its speed, but that isn't enough. You have to be able to see where you're going. You have to be able to steer the ship to the right, to the left, up and down. How do you reach the great ocean depths, where the water pressure has to be counted in the hundreds of atmospheres? How do you come back to the surface? And lastly, how do you stay at a desired depth?" I'm sorry. I hope I'm not being too inquisitive. "Not at all, Professor," replied the captain, after a moment's hesitation, "in view of the fact that you're destined never to leave this submarine. Come into the lounge. That is our real workroom, and there I'll tell you everything you want to know about the Nautilus." Chapter 13. Some Figures. A moment later, we were seated on a sofa in the lounge, smoking cigars. The captain handed me a diagram of the Nautilus showing cross-sections and side views. He then began to describe the ship as follows. Now, Monsieur Aronnax, here are the various dimensions of the ship you're in. It's in the shape of a very elongated cylinder with conical ends, rather like a cigar. This shape has already been used in London in several ships of the same sort. This cylinder is exactly 230 feet long from stem to stern, and its beam at the widest point is 26 feet. It is therefore not built exactly in the ratio of 10 to 1, as with your fast steamers, but its lines are sufficiently long and curved so that the displaced water moves away easily and acts as no obstacle. These two dimensions will enable you, by a simple calculation, to obtain the surface and volume of the Nautilus. It has a surface area of 10,885 square feet and a volume of 52,980 cubic feet, which means that when it is entirely submerged, it displaces 52,980 feet of water cubically, or in other words, 1,657.9 tons. When I laid my plans for a ship destined to sail beneath the surface, I wanted it, when at a state of equilibrium in the water, to be 9/10 submerged, and only 1/10 above the surface. Consequently, its ratio of weight to volume had to be 9 to 10, or in other words, it had to weigh 1,492.13 tons. I therefore had to be careful not to exceed this weight while having it built to the aforementioned dimensions. The Nautilus has two hulls, one inside the other and joined together by T-shaped irons, thus giving this ship great strength. And thanks to this cellular arrangement, it has the resistance of a solid mass. Its sides cannot give way. They adhere to the ship by themselves without rivets, and the homogeneity of its construction, achieved by the perfect union of the materials involved, permits it to defy the most violent seas. These two hulls are made out of steel plates whose density is between 7 and 8/10 that of water. The first of these is no less than 2 inches thick and weighs 434.46 tons. The second hull, along with the keel, which is 28 inches high and 10 inches long, and alone weighs 68 tons, the engine, the ballast, the various accessories and furnishings, the bulkheads and inside braces, all weigh 1,057.67 tons, which added to the 434.46 of the first hull make the required total of 1,492.13 tons. Do you follow me? Yes, I answered. Therefore, continued the captain, when the Nautilus is floating, 1/10 of it is above water. Now, if I have reservoirs with a capacity equal to this 10th, or in other words, 165.79 tons, and fill them with water, the boat would then weigh 1,657.9 tons, and would be completely submerged. And this is exactly what happens, Professor. I have just such reservoirs aboard in the lower parts of the Nautilus. I open some cocks, water enters, and the boat sinks just below the surface. Yes, Captain, but now we have come to the real problem. I understand how you can go just below the surface, but as you go deeper, below this point, when Won't your submarine encounter a pressure, and therefore a force, pushing it upward equal to 1 atmosphere for every 32 feet of water, or almost 15 pounds per square inch? That's right, monsieur. So, unless you fill the Nautilus completely, I don't see how you can make it dive down to great depths. Professor, replied Captain Nemo, you must not confuse static and dynamic situations, or you will fall into serious errors. It requires very little effort to attain the great depths of the ocean, for an object develops a sinking tendency. Please, follow my reasoning. I'm listening, Captain. When I wanted to calculate the increase in weight I had to give the Nautilus in order to dive, I only had to concern myself with the greater density of water at increasingly lower depths. That much is evident, I said. Now, although water is not absolutely incompressible, it is at least compressible only to a very small degree. As a matter of fact, according to the latest calculations, this reduction in volume amounts to no more than a proportion of 0.0000436 per atmosphere, or for each 32 feet of depth. So, if I want to go down to a depth of 3,200 feet, I take into account the reduction in volume at a pressure equivalent to that of a column of water 3,200 feet high, or in other words, a pressure of 100 atmospheres. The reduction in volume would therefore be 0.00436. Hence, I must increase the weight of this ship to 1,665.14 tons, instead of 1,657.9 tons, or in other words, an increase of 7.24 tons. No more than that. No more than that, Monsieur Aronnax, and these figures are easy to check. But I have supplementary reservoirs capable of taking on 100 tons. I can, therefore, go down to a considerable depth. When I want to come back to the surface, I have only to get rid of this water and empty all the reservoirs, and then the Nautilus will again emerge by 1/10 of its total height. To these arguments, based on figures, I could raise no objection. I cannot argue with your calculations, Captain, I answered, and moreover it would be rather ridiculous to do so, since daily experience has proved you right. But I foresee one very real problem. And what is that, monsieur? When you go down to a depth of 3,200 feet, the Nautilus's hull sustains a pressure of 100 atmospheres. If at that moment you want to empty the supplementary reservoirs in order to lighten your ship and permit it to rise to the surface, your pumps must overcome this pressure of 100 atmospheres, which is equal to 1,470 pounds per square inch. That would require a force that could only be supplied by electricity. Captain Nemo quickly interjected. I repeat, monsieur, that the dynamic power of my engines is almost infinite. The Nautilus's pumps have prodigious force, as you were able to see when they threw torrents of water over the Abraham Lincoln. Besides, I only use these supplementary reservoirs to attain depths between 5,000 and 6,500 feet, and that with a view to sparing my machinery. But when I decide to visit the deepest parts of the ocean, 6 or 8 miles below the surface, I use slower, but no less infallible means. What are they, Captain? But this brings me naturally to an explanation of how the Nautilus is maneuvered. I'm very anxious to learn how this is done. In order to steer this ship, starboard to port, in order to maneuver, in a word, horizontally, I use an ordinary rudder with a large afterpiece fixed to the rear of the sternpost, operated by a wheel and pulley tackle. But I can also move the Nautilus up and down by means of two fins attached to the side of the ship at its center of gravity. They are completely movable and are operated from inside by means of powerful levers. As long as these fins are held parallel to the boat, it moves horizontally. When they are placed at an angle, the Nautilus, according to the degree of this angle and the speed at which it is travelling, dives or rises as steeply or as gently as I wish. And if I want to rise even more quickly, I merely disengage the propeller, and water pressure makes the Nautilus rise vertically, like a hydrogen balloon going straight up into the air. "Bravo, Captain!" I cried. "But how can the helmsman follow the course you have given him under water?" The helmsman is inside a special compartment that juts out on the top of the hull, and which is equipped with lens-like windows. "You have a glass that can stand up under such pressures?" "Absolutely. It's fragile when hit, but it's nevertheless very strong. In some experiments made with fishing by electric light in 1864 in the middle of the North Sea, glass plates only 9/32 of an inch thick were found capable of withstanding a pressure of 16 atmospheres, and at the same time permitting powerful heat rays to penetrate them. Now, the lenses I use are more than 8 inches thick at their centers, or in other words, about 30 times thicker." "Granted, Captain Nemo, but in order to see, some light has to pierce the darkness, and I wonder how, in the midst of the black depths—" "Behind the helmsman's compartment there is a powerful electric light, whose rays illuminate the water for a half a mile around." "Bravo! Bravo, Captain! That explains the so-called narwhal's phosphorescence, which so intrigued scientists. While we're on this subject, I would like to ask you if the collision of the Nautilus with the Scotia, which caused a stir, was it accidental?" "Completely accidental, monsieur. I was cruising 6 feet below the surface when the collision took place. Besides, I was able to see that the damage was not really serious." "No, monsieur, it wasn't, but as for your encounter with the Abraham Lincoln—" "Professor, I'm sorry for one of the finest ships in the American Navy, but I was being attacked, and I had to defend myself. Even then, all I did was put the frigate in a position where it could do me no more harm. She will have little trouble repairing her damages in the nearest port." "Ah, Commander," I cried enthusiastically, "your Nautilus is truly an extraordinary ship." "Yes," Captain Nemo replied with genuine emotion, "and I love it as if it were my own flesh and blood. In one of your ships, sailing amid the hazards of the ocean, everything seems fraught with danger. In travelling on the surface of the sea, one's first thoughts are about the abyss below, as the Dutchman Jansen so well put it. But on the Nautilus, one has nothing to fear. The hull itself is untouchable, for it has the rigidity of iron. There is no rigging to be harmed by rolling or pitching, no sails to be carried off by the wind, no boilers to be torn open by steam, no fear of fire, since the ship is made of steel, not wood, no coal supply which can run short, since I run the ship on electricity. No chance encounter to fear, since I am alone in sailing in deep water. No storms to ride out, since several yards below the surface reigns absolute peace. There, monsieur, a ship to end all ships. And if it's true that the designer has more confidence in a boat than the builder, and the builder more than the captain, then you can understand how great is my trust in the Nautilus, since I am its captain, its builder, and designer, all in one. Captain Nemo spoke with an infectious eloquence. He seemed transformed by the fire in his eyes and his impassioned gestures. Yes, he loved this ship, as a father loves his child. But one perhaps indiscreet question naturally came to mind, and I could not help asking him, "Are you then also a nautical engineer, Captain Nemo?" "Yes, Professor," he answered. "I studied in London, Paris, and New York when I was still an inhabitant of dry land." "But how were you able to construct this marvelous Nautilus in secret?" "Every part of it, Monsieur Aronnax, was sent to me from a different part of the globe, and to a disguised address. Its keel was forged by Crusoe, its propeller shaft by Penn and Company at London, the steel plates of the hull by Laird in Liverpool, its propeller by Scott in Glasgow. Its reservoirs were built by Cale and Company in Paris, its engines by Krupp in Prussia, the spur on its bow, the Mottola workshops in Sweden, its precision instruments by Hart Brothers in New York, etc. And each of these companies received my plans under different names. But after these, various sections were made, I answered. They had to be assembled and put in place. Professor, I set up a workshop on a desert island in mid-ocean. There my workers, or rather my companions, whom I taught and educated, helped me complete the Nautilus. When it was then finished, fire destroyed all trace of our stay on the island, which I would have blown up had it been possible. But this boat, it must have cost a fortune. An iron ship costs $225 per ton, Monsieur Aronnax. Now, the Nautilus weighs almost 1,500 tons. It therefore cost $337,500, or $400,000 with all its furnishings, or close to $1 million counting the works of art and other collections it contains. One last question, Professor. Go ahead. You must therefore be a very rich man. Infinitely rich, monsieur, and I could easily pay France's $2 billion debt. I stared fixedly at the strange person telling me these things. Was he taking advantage of my credulity? The future would tell me. Chapter 14. The Black Stream. That part of the Earth's surface occupied by water is evaluated at more than 147,959,620 square miles, or over 94 billion acres. This liquid mass has a volume of 2,250,000,000 cubic miles, and would form a sphere with a diameter of over 2,000 miles, which would weigh are 3 quintillion tons. And in order to understand this number, one must realize that a quintillion is to a billion what a billion is to one. Or in other words, that there are as many billions in a quintillion as there are units in a billion. And this mass of liquid is more or less equal to the quantity of water that all the rivers of the earth would pull forth in 40 million years. In early geological times, a period of fire was followed by a period of water. At first, the ocean covered everything. Then, little by little, during the Silurian period, mountain tops appeared, forming islands, disappeared beneath the floods, and then rose again, joining together to form continents, and finally the land became fixed, as we now know it. The solid element had won 37,657,000 square miles from the liquid element, or slightly over 24 billion acres. The shape of the continents makes it possible to divide these waters into 5 great areas: the Arctic, Antarctic, Indian, Atlantic, and Pacific Oceans. The Pacific Ocean extends from north to south between the 2 polar circles and from west to east between Asia and America through 145 degrees of longitude. It is the calmest of all the oceans. Its currents are wide and slow, its tides moderate, and its rainfall abundant. Such was the ocean I was destined to first see under the strangest of circumstances. "Professor," said Captain Nemo, "if you would like to accompany me, I am going to take our bearings and determine our point of departure for the voyage. It's 11:45. I'm going to surface." The captain pressed a button 3 times. The pumps began to expel the water from the reservoirs. The pressure gauge showed that the Nautilus was rising, and then it stopped. "We're there," said the captain. I walked to the companionway leading up to the platform. I climbed the iron steps, passed through an open hatch, and arrived on the top side of the Nautilus. The platform was only 2.5 feet above water level. The bow and stern of the Nautilus had that spindle shape, which gave it the form of a long cigar. I noticed that its steel plates overlapped somewhat, making them look like the scales of large land reptiles. I could, therefore, easily understand how even with the finest binoculars this vessel had always been taken for a marine animal. Toward the middle of the platform, the dinghy, half buried in the hull of the ship, protruded slightly. Fore and aft there were 2 small compartments with inclined sides and containing windows of thick lens-like glass. One contained the helmsman, who steered the Nautilus, and the other held the powerful electric light which guided him on his route. The sea was splendid, the sky serene. The long ship scarcely felt the broad ocean swell. A light easterly breeze rippled the surface of the water. The horizon was free from any trace of mist and could be clearly seen for purposes of observation. Nothing was in sight. No reef, no island, no Abraham Lincoln. A vast desert. Captain Nemo measured the height of the sun with his sextant, thus getting his latitude. He waited for several minutes until, through the eyepiece, he could see the sun touching the horizon. During this operation, not one of his muscles moved, and the instrument would not have been more immobile in a marble hand. "It's noon, Professor," he said. "Whenever you want." I took one last look at the sea, yellow as it always is near the coast of Japan, and I went back down to the lounge. There the captain determined his bearings and chronometrically calculated his longitude. He then said, "Monsieur Aronnax, we're at 137 degrees, 15 minutes west." "Of what meridian?" I asked anxiously, hoping his answer would indicate his nationality. "Monsieur," he replied, "I have chronometers set according to the meridians of Paris, Greenwich, and Washington, but in your honor, I shall use the one set according to Paris." This answer told me nothing. I bowed, and the commander went on. 137 degrees 15 minutes west of the Paris meridian, and 30 degrees 7 minutes north latitude, or, in other words, about 300 miles from the coast of Japan. And today, the 8th of November, at noon, begins our voyage of underwater exploration. "May God be with us," I replied. "And now, Professor," the captain added, "I leave you to your studies. I have given orders for our course to be set for east-northeast and at a depth of 165 feet. Here are some large-scale charts on which you may follow our journey. This room is at your disposal, and now, with your permission, I shall retire." Captain Nemo bowed. I remained alone, lost in thoughts about the commander of the Nautilus. Would I ever find out to what country this strange man belongs, he who boasted that he belonged to none? What had brought on this hatred he felt for the human race, a hatred which was perhaps seeking some terrible revenge? Was he one of those unrecognized scientists, one of those geniuses whom the world had humiliated, as Conseil put it, a modern Galileo? Or one of those scientists like the American, Maury, whose career had been shattered by political revolutions? I could not yet say. As for me, whom fate had thrown on board this ship, and whose life Captain Nemo held in his hands, he had received me coldly, but nonetheless hospitably, except for one detail. He had never shaken my hand when I stretched out to him, nor had he ever stretched his out to me. For a whole hour I remained lost in these thoughts, trying to penetrate this mystery which so fascinated me. Then my glance fell on the vast map of the world laid out on the table, and I placed a finger on our present position. The sea, like land, also has rivers. They are special currents that can be easily recognized by their temperature and color, and the most remarkable of these is called the Gulf Stream. Science has been able to determine the place of 5 such currents: one in the North Atlantic, a second in the South Atlantic, a third in the Northern Pacific, a fourth in the South Pacific, and a fifth in the Southern Indian Ocean. It seems likely that once upon a time a sixth existed in the Northern Indian Ocean, when the Caspian and Aral seas were united to the great Asian lakes and formed a single expanse of water. Now, the point on the map indicated by my finger was in one of these great currents, the Black Stream, or as the Japanese call it, the Kuro-Siwo. It starts in the Bay of Bengal, where it is heated by the tropical sun, crosses the Straits of Malacca, flows along the coast of Asia, curves along the North Pacific to the Aleutian Islands, carrying along with it the trunks of camphor trees and other objects it has picked up on its way, and cutting a clear path through the ocean with the deep blue of its warm waters. It was this current the Nautilus was going to cross. I looked at it on the map. I could see it lose itself in the vast expanse of the Pacific, and I felt as if I were being carried off with it. When Ned Land and Conseil appeared at the door of the lounge, my two friends were thunderstruck by all the marvels spread before my eyes.
"Where are we? Where are we?" cried the Canadian. "In the Quebec Museum?"
With Monsieur's permission, Conseil interjected, it seems more like the Summerland Palace. My friends, I answered, motioning for them to enter. You're neither in Canada nor in France, but on board the Nautilus, 165 feet below the surface of the ocean. If Monsieur says so, we must believe him, said Conseil. But this room is enough to astonish even a Belgian like myself. Don't worry about your astonishment, my friend. Look around. For a good classifier like you, there's enough here to keep you busy for a good while. I didn't have to encourage Conseil. He was already leaning over the cases and mumbling the naturalist's language. Class of gastropods, a family of bucanoids, genus of cowries, species Cyproea madagascarensis, etc. Meanwhile, Ned Land, who cared little for shells and mollusks, questioned me about my interview with Captain Nemo. Had I found out who he was, where he came from, where he was going, how deep he would take us? In short, 1,000 questions which I didn't have time to answer. I told him all I knew, or rather, didn't know, and asked him what he had heard or seen.
I haven't heard or seen a thing, answered the Canadian. I haven't even seen any of the crew on this ship. Could that be electrical too?
Electrical?
I swear I'm almost ready to believe it. But you, Monsieur Aronnax,
asked Ned Land, still clinging to his ideas,
can you tell me how many men there are on board? 10, 20, 50, 100?
I have no way of knowing, Ned. And besides, for the moment anyhow, please give up your ideas of seizing control of the Nautilus, or of escaping. This boat is a masterpiece of modern industry, and I feel lucky to have seen it. Many people would jump at the chance we've had, if only to stroll in a land of wonders. So be calm, and see what goes on around us.
See what goes on around us,
cried the harpooner.
We can't, and never will, see a thing from inside this steel-plated prison. This boat travels and navigates like a blind man.
Just as Ned Land uttered these last words, the room was plunged into darkness. Total darkness. The ceiling lights had gone out so quickly that it made my eyes hurt, just as if we had gone abruptly from utter darkness to brilliant light. We all remained silent, without moving, not knowing what pleasant or unpleasant surprise awaited us. But then there was a noise of something sliding. It seemed as if panels were moving along the sides of the Nautilus.
This is the end, cried Ned Land.
Order of Hydromedusae, murmured Conseil. Suddenly light entered from each side of the room through two oblong openings. The surrounding water appeared brilliantly lit up by the electric light atop the Nautilus. Two glass panels separated us from the ocean. At first I shuddered at the thought of this fragile partition would break, but it was held in by strong copper frames which gave it an almost limitless resistance. The sea was distinctly visible within a radius of a mile around the Nautilus. What a sight! What pen could describe it? Who could paint the effects of light penetrating these transparent layers of water and growing dimmer as it reached into the distant corners of the ocean? The clarity of seawater is well known. It is clearer than spring water. The mineral and organic substances it holds in suspension actually increase its transparency. In certain parts of the ocean, in the West Indies for example, a sandy bottom almost 500 feet down can be seen with surprising clarity, and the sun's rays are apparently able to penetrate to depths of 1,000 feet. But the Nautilus could produce its own light in the ocean depths. It was no longer illuminated water, but liquid light. If one admits Ehrenberg's theory that the great ocean depths are illuminated by phosphorescence, then nature has reserved one of her most extraordinary spectacles for its inhabitants, as I could see by the 1,000 different ways the light played about before my eyes. On each side of the room I had a window open to unexplored depths. The darkness within the room made it easier to see out, and we looked through this clear glass as if through the window of an immense aquarium. The Nautilus didn't seem to be moving, but this was an illusion, due to the fact that there were no points of reference. Occasionally, however, lines of water divided by the spur on the submarine's prow would stream by us at great speed. We stood leaning against the windows in a state of stupefaction, and no one broke the silence until Conseil finally said, "You wanted to see something, Ned, and now you've got it."
"Unbelievable,"
murmured the Canadian, who had forgotten his rage and plans for escape and now felt irresistibly attracted to this spectacle before him.
"It's worth coming a long way to see something like this."
I said to myself. Now I understand the life Captain Nemo leads. He's created a private world for himself, full of the most astounding marvels.
"But where are the fish?" observed the Canadian. "I don't see any fish."
"What difference does it make, Ned?" replied Conseil, "since you couldn't tell them apart anyway."
"Me, a fisherman!"
This started an argument between the two friends, for they were both knowledgeable on the subject of fish, but in different ways. Everyone knows that fish form the fourth and last class of the subkingdom of the vertebrates. They have been very accurately described as vertebrates with double circulatory system and cold blood, breathing through gills and living in the water. They form two distinct groups, those with true bone structure and those which are cartilaginous, that is to say, whose spinal column is made of cartilage. Perhaps the Canadian had a vague idea of this distinction, but Conseil knew it only too well. And now that he had become such good friends with Ned, he felt he had to show off his knowledge. He therefore said, "Ned, you're a killer of fish, a first-class fisherman. You've caught a great number of these interesting creatures, but I'll bet you don't know how to classify them."
"Yes, I do," answered the harpooner in all seriousness. "They're classified into those you can eat and those you can't."
"That's a glutton's way of classifying them," replied Conseil. "But let's see if you know the difference between fish with true bone structure and those which are cartilaginous."
"A little bit, Conseil."
"And the subdivisions of these two big classes?"
"I haven't a clue," answered the Canadian.
"Well, Ned, listen and concentrate.
Fish with a true bone structure are divided into 6 orders. First, the Acanthopterygi, whose upper jaw is complete and mobile and whose gills are shaped like a gum. This order comprises 15 families, that is to say, 3/4 of all known fish. Type, the common perch.
Not bad eating, answered Ned Land.
Second, Conseil continued, the Abdominalis, whose vertical fins are underneath behind the pectorals, without being attached to the shoulder bone. This order is divided into 5 families and includes most freshwater fish. Type, the carp and the pike.
Said the Canadian with an air of disdain. Freshwater fish.
Third, said Conseil, the Subrachi, whose ventral fins are attached beneath the pectoral fins and directly onto the shoulder bone. This order comprises 4 families. Type, plaice, tabs, turbots, brills, sole, etc.
Marvelous, cried the harpooner, who refused to consider fish from any other point of view but that of how good they were to eat.
Fourth,
replied Conseil, unconcerned.
the apods, with elongated bodies, lacking ventral fins and covered with thick and often sticky skin. This order contains only 1 family. Type, eels.
Not so good, replied Ned Land.
Fifth,
said Conseil,
the Lophobranchi, whose jaws are complete and free-moving, but whose gills are made of little tufts, grouped in pairs along their brachial arches. This order comprises only 1 family. Type, seahorses and pipefishes.
Terrible, terrible, said the harpooner.
Sixth, said Conseil, the Phlaetocranthi, whose maxillary bone is attached to the side of the intermaxillary which forms the jaw, and whose posttemporal bone is united with the skull, thus making it immobile. The fish of this order lack true ventral fins, and they comprise 2 families. Types, the globefish and the sunfish.
They're enough to dishonor the pot they're cooked in, cried the Canadian.
Did you understand all that, Ned?
Conseil asked. Not in the least, my friend, replied the harpooner. But go on, anyhow. It's all very interesting.
As for cartilaginous fish,
continued the imperturbable Conseil,
they only comprise 3 orders.
The fewer the better, said Ned.
First, the cyclostomy, whose jaws are welded onto a kind of mobile ring, and whose gills consist of a number of holes. This order comprises only 1 family. Type, the lamprey.
You can't help but like them, said Ned Land.
Second, the sludgy, whose gills are like those of the cyclostomy, but whose lower jaw is mobile. This order, the most important of the class, comprises 2 families, or types, rays and sharks.
What? Cried Ned. Rays and sharks? In the same order? But let me tell you, my friend, that in the interest of the rayfish, it would be best not to put them together in a tank.
Third, continued Conseil, the Storiones, whose gills are usually consisting of only 1 slit with a gill cover. This order includes 4 genera. Type, the sturgeon.
Conseil, you've kept the best for the last. Or, at least, in my opinion. Was that all?
Yes, Ned, said Conseil. But even when you know that much, you're still knowing nothing, for these families are divided into genera, subgenera, species, varieties. Well then, Conseil, said the harpooner, leaning against one of the windows, here are your varieties passing by now. Look, fish, cried Conseil. Oh, it's as if we're in front of an aquarium. No, I answered, for an aquarium is a cage, and these fish here are as free as birds in the air. Come on, Conseil, tell us their names, said Ned Land. Oh, I can't, answered Conseil. That is my master's job. And, to tell the truth, although this fine young man was an enthusiastic classifier, he was not a naturalist, and I don't know if he could have distinguished a tuna from a bonito. In a word, he was the opposite of Ned Land, who could name all these fish without a moment's hesitation. A triggerfish, I said. A Chinese triggerfish, answered Ned Land. Genus of Bellistes, family of Sclerodermi, order of Flectognathi, murmured Conseil. There was no doubt about it. Between the two of them, Ned and Conseil would have made a distinguished naturalist. The Canadian had made no mistake. A school of triggerfish with their flat bodies and grainy skin, and with the spike on their top fin, were playing around the Nautilus, waving the 4 rows of spines on each side of their tails. Their colouring was marvellous, white underneath and grey on top, with gold spots which glistened in the sombre, swirling light. Some rays were undulating around them like a piece of cloth flapping in the wind, and among them I noticed, to my great joy, a Chinese ray, yellowish on top and a delicate pink underneath, armed with 3 spikes behind his eye, a rare species, and one that was even doubtful in Lassobidi's day, for he had never seen one except in a collection of Japanese drawings. For 2 hours the whole aquatic army escorted the Nautilus. Among these fish, as they played and leaped, rivaling each other in beauty, brilliance, and speed, I could make out a green wrasse, a red mullet with a double black stripe, a type of goby with a rounded caudal fin, white in colour and with violet spots on his back, a Japanese scomber, a beautiful mackerel of the type that inhabit these waters, with a blue body and silver head, some blue-gold azuras, whose name alone is better than any description, some striped gilt heads with blue and yellow fins, another type of gilt head with a black band across its caudal fin, yet another type with an elegant corset of 6 stripes, some olostoma, well described by their popular name of flute-mouth or snipe-fish, some specimens of which grow to be a yard long, some giant salamanders and spiny morays, 6-foot-long serpents with small, lively eyes and with a huge mouth bristling with teeth, etc. Our admiration didn't diminish for a moment. We kept up an incessant commentary. Ned would name the fish, Conseil would classify them, and I would go into ecstasies over their movements and the beauties of their forms. Never before had I been able to observe these creatures alive and free in their natural element. I won't cite all the varieties of fish which passed before our dazzled eyes, an entire collection of those living in Japanese and Chinese waters. These fish would gather around the ship thicker than birds in the sky, undoubtedly attracted by the gleam of the electric light. But suddenly, the lounge itself was bathed in light. The iron panels closed. The enchanting vision disappeared. But I kept on dreaming until my eyes fell on the instruments hanging on the wall. The compass still pointed north by northeast.
The pressure gauge showed a pressure of 5 atmospheres, corresponding to a depth of 160 feet, and the electric log showed us to be traveling at 15 knots. I waited for Captain Nemo, but he did not appear. It was 5 o'clock. Ned Land and Conseil returned to their cabin, and I to mine. My dinner was waiting for me. It consisted of turtle soup made from the most delicate hawkbills, a surmullet whose white flesh had been rolled and folded, and whose liver had been prepared as an excellent side dish, and then some fillets of emperor fish, which seemed to me even better than salmon. I spent the evening reading, writing, and thinking. Then I was overtaken by drowsiness. I stretched out on my eelgrass bed and fell sound asleep while the Nautilus glided through the strong current of the Black Stream. And on that calm and quiet note of reflection and identification of all of those wonderful species of the deep, we will end our reading for today. One of the things that makes me so glad to live in a time like the one we do is the ability for us, through documentaries and television series, and even, if we get the chance, real undersea adventures through scuba or other equipment, to experience the wonders which the people in the days when this book was written could only dream of. We are very lucky in many respects, though there is still so much more to do to make the world a better place for everyone, people, fish, and the environment. Thank you so much for joining me on this little reverie today as we explore the workings of the Nautilus and the life of the world outside it in Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I have to leave you now, but until next we meet, I wish you all the best. And goodbye.
I haven't heard nor seen anything, answered the Canadian. I haven't even seen any of the crew of this ship. Could that be electrical too?